Welcome everyone. If you have struggled to take your food photos from something like this to something like this tutorial is going to be a guide of how to take your base image layer and craft it right through to it is now ready for professional publishing or commercial digital display. So we're going to be diving into the finessing of editing food photography. So whether you're a seasoned pro or you're just starting out, this guide will walk you through my essential steps to get you from ground one to stunning. So let's get straight into it. Before we can begin editing the photo, in transparency I've already cropped this to 16:9 so it fits a YouTube screen nicely. So before we can begin editing this photo, we first of all need to look at its D.N.A. and that will be in the form of what lighting is being used, what is the nature of the lighting, but also what is happening within its composition. Now composition can be divided into two subcategories, one of which is the physical, and these are the physical things that are happening within the frame. The second one of which is the non-physical, and these are the things that we can apply in the editing to help direct the viewer's eye to what is the most relevant and important parts of this photo, which would be obviously the food. So if we bring up the grid, the rule of thirds, we can clearly see on the top leftmost intersection is the cutlery. On the bottom leftmost intersection is where the food begins, and it begins to travel through to center frame. And on the bottom right intersection is the edge of the bowl. So that means this image has a visual flow working within it. And that visual flow is the sinister angle. So we will want to keep all edits sympathetic with that flow. The next thing that I can see in this image is that we also have subframing. We have the bowl. The food is within a frame. Next, we have depth of field. Next, we have good geometry within the subject. We also have leading lines, faintly. And lastly, we have invisible convergent lines forming because of the motion of the hands in the directions that they are facing. So those are the physical compositional devices which are being used within this photo. Now, when a human sees visual data, there is also four things that it will look for in this order. Number one is the presence of other humans and human faces. In this case, we have human hands and we have cutlery. Humans are the only animal that eat with cutlery, so that is going to be the surrogate for the human face. Next will be the brightest area of the frame. Next, they will look for the highest point of contrast. And lastly, they will look for the greatest point of saturation. So these are things that we are going to want to keep in mind as we edit this photo to bring it to life. As we progress through the editing of this photo, in the bottom right hand corner, you will be able to see my layers and masks in Capture One. And each tool, as it is relevant, you will see appear here in the top right of the frame. So let's begin with lens corrections. This step is often overlooked, but it is crucial for ensuring your image is free from the quirks of your lens. Most lenses will introduce some form of distortion, whether it's barrel distortion, pin cushioning, or vignetting. By applying lens corrections, we're going to straighten out those lines and ensure that the image is a true representation of the dish. It's a very simple adjustment that just helps lay a clean foundation for everything else that we're going to be doing. Now in Capture One, if it supports your lens, it will make some corrections automatically on your behalf, but it doesn't always do so. So always double check that your lens corrections for diffraction, chromatic aberration, and so forth have been corrected for. It's a very simple step, but as stated, it is often overlooked. Now, the next logical step after lens corrections would be I.C.C, or in-camera color calibration. Now, I'm a Fujifilm user, which this whole channel is dedicated to the X-Trans sensor, so that opens up this entire world of the Fujifilm simulations. Now, each Fujifilm simulation will render certain hues differently, and it will also render each hue with different saturations and different luminance values. Now, I shoot exclusively in Eterna or Pro Negative Standard, and the reason for that is because they are very low contrast and saturation. Therefore, I have full control over contrast and saturation. But if we were to move this through to film standard, which this is more in line with what you would find from Sony, Canon, Nikon colors, as you can see, there is an automatic bump in the saturation and the contrast. So anytime I'm shooting not on a Fujifilm camera, I always lower contrast and saturation to give us neutral and solid a foundation point for editing this photo. So if we swap this back now to Eterna, that is a very neutral, flat starting point for me, and it makes the most sense to start from that position. So let's put these tools away now and move through to the next stage of the editing process. So the next logical step would be white balance. And this is where we're going to ensure the colors in our image are true to life. And if your whites or other neutral colors in your photos look a little bit blue or yellow, it can throw off the entire image at times. So we're going to adjust the white balance to match the lighting conditions for when the photo was taken. So whether that was in daylight, tungsten, or something else, this step is quite critical to ensuring that greens are vibrant, reds are rich, whites are crisp, etc. So to ensure we're achieving a good neutral white balance, we're going to do this in conjunction with the histogram. So let's get started. If we bring out the histogram, and we'll make it larger so everyone can see it at home, as well as the white balancing tool. Sorry, we just connected it there. We will begin to establish what is a good white balance. Now, it has a good rule of thumb. If we use a brush tool and we extend it larger and we place it over what is the subject of this photo, we can see on the histogram an orange line. And this shows us where the tonal values are for the subject of this photo. In this particular photo, it is sitting in the undertones. So that is above the shadows, but below the midtones. So that essentially means I'm going to be most concerned with the white balance in this area of the photo. Now, when we look at the red, the green, and the blue channel, when they are overlapping, they will form a white line. And we can think of this as algorithmically correct white balance. Now, as you can see, the blue channel is sitting quite above the red and the green channel. So some color correction in this photo is going to be needed, but we'll touch on that when we approach it. But as we can see here, the red and the green curves are almost overlapping. They're almost forming a white line here in the undertones, and they're almost forming a white line here in the shadows going through to the blacks. Now, this is going to be a challenging photo, and an easy way we can handle this is just use this eyedropper tool and click on the white t-shirt. So not a lot of movement. That at the time of capture, I had set my in-camera white balance to match my lighting. And I think when I look at this photo, this is about as close as what we're going to get to as neutral of white balance as what is possible. So we'll leave it at that for now. Now, the histogram in relation to white balance, that's not the only information it shows us. It also gives us some information regarding exposure. So that would be the next logical step, would be to work on the exposure values, because the more we can evenly distribute this histogram from left to right, the more we are naturally increasing contrast and therefore depth perception within the image itself. So when we look at this histogram, we can see there is a fair amount of space before we hit hard right, and there is a small amount of space before we hit hard left. Now the goal here is to evenly distribute this without creating too large a spike towards the right or towards the left in its extremities, which would indicate there is some form of clipping or loss of data. So if we put this white balance and tint tool away, and we now bring out the exposure tab, we can clearly see that we can increase the exposure on this image. Now the goal here is still to achieve as evenly distributive of histogram, to therefore create as neutral of starting point as what is possible. We can always adjust the highlights and the shadows as we go, but on this base image layer, we're simply looking to create as neutral a base as what we can. So when we look at the full frame of this image, we now have a very evenly distributed histogram and a good exposure, but to my eye, the midtones, particularly in this tabletop and right here on the edge of this bowl, are coming in a little hot. So we're just going to lower the brightness, which affects midtones in Capture One. I think around about there is a good place for now. And as you can see, we still have a very well distributed histogram. So now that we've established exposure, we can put that tool away and we can put back the white balance tool, and we can now move through to the levels tool. So just let me expand it so you can all see it at home more clearly. So once we've got the exposure in the right ballpark, it's now time to fine tune those tones by establishing what our black point will be, what our midtones will be, and what our white point will be. The black point is obviously the darkest part of your image, and this is where you want true blacks to sit, but without losing too much shadow detail. The whites is obviously the opposite, and this is the brightest area of the photo, of where you want your whites to look quite crisp, but you want to stop short of blowing out your highlights. And the midtones is the intersection between those two values. And adjusting them, it helps to achieve the right balance, but also it gives a sense of dimension as well as contrast to the image. So if we remember back to that histogram, there was a small gap on the left-hand side, so there was no true blacks. So we're just going to increase the true blacks. Now this photo was shot in soft light, so there's no reason for me to be emphasizing glaring light or bright light. So I'm just going to give a little bit of highlight roll off, but I'm also still going to lower these midtones. Now this will give the perception that the hero of this image, the food, is now slightly underexposed, and you would be correct, it is, but we're going to address that as this tutorial continues. Now that we've established black point, midtones, and whites through the levels tool, the next tool that we're going to investigate will be the tone curves. Now, just let me make these larger for you at home. Now this is one of the true heavy lifting tools in photo editing. So this one's going to require a small amount of explanation. Now the tone curves are a very heavy hitting tool, and this is what's going to allow us to build contrast, so therefore depth perception, and therefore dimension to the photo. Most typically you will find an S shape applied to the tone curves, but that is not the only tone curve that we can use. And in future tutorials, I'll demonstrate where increased complexity within the tone curves can really bring a photo to life, but that will be in future lessons. For now, let's quickly cover what's happening here in Capture One. So we have 5 tone curves: the RGB, the Luma, the red, the green, and the blue. So what is the difference between each of these tone curves? Within the RGB tone curve, the more contrast that we apply, or the greater the curves, the more it will increase contrast, but the more it will also increase saturation. So if used heavy-handed, it can create false color as well as color burn. So we want to use that carefully. In the Luma channel, this will increase contrast without affecting saturation. But the more heavy-handed we use it, the more it will begin to add like a bleach bypass effect to the photo. So again, care and consideration is needed. Once we move through to the red, the green, and the blue, these operate off of a CMYK functionality. So if we go up, it adds red. If we go down, it adds cyan. And the green, if we go up, it adds green. If we go down, it adds magenta. And in the blue, obviously if we go up, it adds blue. If we go down, it adds yellow. So let's start in the Luma channel. And we're going to use this eyedropper. We're going to pick out where the shadows are, where the midtones are, and where the highlights are. So when I look at this point here and this point here, I know the food part of me will sit within the tonality in this part of the tone curve. So anything that comes before it or anything that comes after it, I'm less interested in. That doesn't mean I'm going to be unmindful of it, but I really want to target where the food can be found. So let's start building some universal contrast. Now again, we don't want to do anything too heavy-handed here because we're going to be working across all 5 tone curves. Now earlier in this tutorial, I set a black point, but for my photography style, I actually don't like there to be a black point. I will still establish one to get that neutral, strong foundation, and now I can begin to move away from it. So I'm going to elevate and fade the black point by 6 points here, but I'm also going to bring the shadows down an equal amount to avoid the photo now looking milky, but we're also going to re-establish where the highlights are. When it comes to the reds, this pear has a wonderful crimson color to it, and it seems to be sitting in the shadows. So I'm going to put a check mark here, but I'm also going to put a stop point here. And I'm going to increase the red channel, let's say 3 points, just to bring depth of color to this pear into that part of the photo. When I look at the greens, well, there is no substantial greens in this photo, so I don't feel there really needs to be any development of the green tone curve. When it comes to the blue tone curve, if we remember back to the histogram, we can see that there is a small spike in the blue channel here, which would be represented in the tone curve here. So we're just going to bring this down a few points, but I think that's about as much as we can color correct that blue channel for this photo without throwing off all of the other colors. Now, to foreshadow what is coming up later in this tutorial, I already know I'm going to be working with a blue and yellow color grade. So I'm going to begin to establish that in the tone curves. So if we come to the blacks and we come up a few points, we then come to the whites and we come down a few points, we're beginning to add a blush of blue to the shadows, and a very small touch of yellow to the highlights. Now in Capture One, the tone curves can be quite powerful. That adding 2 points up or down in any area of the tone curve, sometimes 2 points is not quite enough, but if you go to 3 points of movement, it's now a little bit too much. So it can be an extremely powerful tool within Capture One. So we will put that away and we will now focus on the high dynamic range tool and how we can use this to get macro adjustments within that tone curve. So when it comes to working with the high dynamic range tool, anytime you're working with raw files, that this can allow us to get some more macro control over values that we have set in the tone curves. So this can help us recover shadows, highlights, and ultimately the goal is to bring a more balanced and realistic look to the photo. And so ultimately the goal here would be we still want to retain a reasonable level of texture in the shadows as well as the highlights without anything becoming too blocky or too blown out and hot. So the goal is to ensure that every part of the image, from the darkest corners to your brightest highlights, retains at least some reasonable level of detail and looks natural. So for this particular image, we can begin to up the highlights. I think I might increase the shadows just a smidgen. The white point is just fine, but I'm going to lower the black point ever so slightly because the image just does still have a tad of milkiness to it. So that is the high dynamic range tool now used. I'm happy with where this photo is. Now this tutorial has gone on for long enough. I'm going to break it into 3 parts. The follow-on next 2 parts will not be as long as this one, but we have now established the base image layer, which is going to be the strong foundation for all of the edits that are to come next. I look forward to seeing you in part 2. Have a great day.